You're listening to an episode of What on Earth is Going On? This show was originally broadcast on the radio at CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. It is now available to you in this format with all spoken content unabridged. For more information, visit wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, my name is Ben Charland. Welcome to What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. Today's subject is a fascinating new book called Selfie by Will Storr. Selfie is roughly a history of the self, from the nascent individualism of ancient Greece to the rampant selfie stick narcissism of the modern age. The book asks what the self is and what our delusions might be about it, and of course, how we humans became so self-obsessed. It is precisely the kind of book that I want to talk about on this show, if only because it had me putting it down every couple of pages or sometimes every couple of sentences to stop and think and shift my worldview. Joining me to talk about Selfie is a friend of mine, Jody MacPherson, a communications professional in Calgary. She is someone whose perspective I value greatly. But you might notice something a little different about this episode as compared to previous ones. Jody and I have both read this book, but neither of us are experts in the subject. Our conversation is instead a sort of one-on-one book club, and I would like to have more of these going forward. Now, if you want to recommend a book that addresses the question, what on earth is going on, please reach out. And if you like the show, the people, the questions, the subjects, spread the word. Share it on social media, pass on the website wogoshow.com to those who you think might be interested, and give it a review in iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use. Most of all, keep the conversation going. Now, without further ado, let's talk about Selfie. All right, I am here with Jody MacPherson at Calgary City Hall, where she works. We're going to talk about the book Selfie by Will Storr, and the subtitle of this book is How We Became So Self-Obsessed and What It's Doing to Us. Jody, welcome to the program.
Thanks for asking me.
So, as always, the first question we always start with is, what on earth is going on? This book, for me, was fascinating. But it's not just about selfies and selfie culture. It's about really the history of the individual and where that idea of the self comes from. So just for our listeners to know, we actually took a selfie right before we started recording, and that'll probably be on social media by the time you're hearing this. So Jody, to start us off, what on earth is going on according to this book?
Well, I think from my read of the book, which I really, really enjoyed, by the way, I think that what Will is talking about is an idea that individual concepts of self have been elevated throughout history to the point where we've got these various false narratives around self-esteem and etc., to the point where narcissism has kind of reached epidemic levels. And in the book, he talks about how that was achieved or what kind of factors played into it. And he talks about the misrepresentation of science, the science around self-esteem, and also the intensification of social media and the digital world. And finally, he kind of mentions how it was cheered on by those who kind of turn human societies into a game in the name of free markets. So brings in the whole neoliberalism thing into the conversation.
A lot of what you just said is about the last 100 years of the history of the self, and especially the self-esteem movement, the encounter movement in California. But of course, the one of the big stories in the book is that the California State Assemblyman, John Vasconcellos, who essentially got California to pay for the government of California to pay for a study and essentially a program to boost self-esteem, which became a hallmark of Western countries. That self-esteem became hugely important. And I remember growing up, I'm born in 1984, I remember growing up that my mom thought that self-esteem was a really important part of my upbringing. But what's really important about self-esteem in this respect is that that study was actually discredited a lot later because the scientists they weren't so much muzzled as they just agreed that, well, maybe our not all of our findings need to be discussed, and it's okay if you stretch the truth a little bit about it. And so this self-esteem movement might be a little bit unfounded, even though it's so much a part of our lexicon now. It's part of our world. It's part of how we identify being members of Western society. I read a review in the New York Times about this book, and the review actually ends in saying that going back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who talked about self-esteem, and Will Storr doesn't talk about Rousseau at all, which is surprising to the reviewer. And Rousseau said that there's two kinds of self-love. There's amour propre, which is the self-love that is given to you by society, but there's also amour de soi, which is self-love for preservation, to preserve yourself, to save yourself from risk and from threat. The latter one, amour de soi, is really always going to be wholesome because it's defending yourself. But the other one can be both good and bad. But what essentially the reviewer is saying is that if you want self-esteem, earn it. What John Vasconcelos is saying, and what a lot of the self-esteem movement is saying in the 20th century is, if you want self-esteem, well, feel it. You deserve to feel self-esteem. And that has led us perhaps in part to this epidemic of narcissism. But what Will Storr does that I found fascinating is he goes all the way back to before the ancient Greeks, to how we work together in a tribal society, and then where this idea of the self came from in ancient Greece.
Yeah, that was part of my favorite part, because it just talks about the difference between the Western world and how we basically, back to Aristotle, really believed that we could be godlike, that we were perfectible, as he calls it, the perfectible self, and that we just had to work harder at it. I was just so fascinated by the story about Vasco and the California State Assemblyman and what happened there, because of course I was totally influenced by all of that, but I didn't know why. And so when I read back about what had happened, I mean, they thought self-esteem was the cure for everything, or the cause of all problems. I mean, in one section I wrote down, he said, moreover, just by raising self-esteem, you could help solve a massive array of chronic social problems: child abuse, educational failure, teenage pregnancy, alcohol and drug abuse, welfare dependency, and crime and violence. So they really just believed that this was the source of all the problems. And so this guy really pushed his idea to the point where in California, they actually formed a task force, and the task force originally was made fun of. And in fact, Gary Trudeau in the Doonesbury cartoon, and he did a whole series on it, and they really were making fun of them. But in the end, they did actually get money to do research, like you said, and they did the research. They put out a report. And after that, what it was shocking about it was just how quickly it exploded. Like 4 months later, 86% of California elementary school districts and 83% of high school districts had implemented self-esteem programs. So they just went and ran with it. And it wasn't until this guy named Roy Baumeister in 1996 started to challenge the research that they started to rethink it. But it shaped so many lives, and had already kind of just gone off the rails. Well,
that was what was surprising to me, because in the chapter before Vasco, John Vasconcelos is mentioned, Will Storr says in the book, this man has done more to change your life than almost anybody else. And I'm thinking, okay, get serious. But then I read about this and thought, that may very well be true, because it led to other things, whether it's the narcissism of the internet age, or taking a selfie. I mean, this can be traced back to wanting to have self-esteem. We don't take selfies only because we think we look good in them. We take them because it seems to be the right thing to do to boost our image of ourselves, which we have come to assume is important, but was not always that way, especially when Will Storr talks about the Middle Ages and how if you want to get along and get ahead, which is one of his catchphrases in the book, that this need to get along and get ahead for a human being will define who you are and how you're raised and how you fit into society. And in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to get along and get ahead, you needed to be low-key, quiet, subservient, and obedient to the authorities in the feudal era. And that, of course, changed with the Renaissance. It changed with the Industrial Revolution and social mobility. But one thing that you mentioned that I found interesting in the book was that we have taken a godlike perspective of ourselves, that we view ourselves as gods. And there's a couple of things in the book that I found fascinating. The human potential movement of the 60s that led to a lot of this stuff and was a sort of a parallel to Vasco. Their twist was that we are gods, and that means that we're responsible for everything that happens to us. If we're poor, it's our fault. If we're rich, it's our doing. And as a god, no one else can do that for us. And then the other thing about that is that if we are gods, then our feelings are sacred. And if our feelings are sacred, then those who hurt our feelings should be punished. And that is a fascinating insight into what's happening now in popular culture, where if someone's feelings are hurt, it seems like you can punish those who hurt them. 20 years ago, that would have been absurd to say in the public discourse.
Right. That whole human potential movement was just so interesting. And some of the characters, and there's this one thing I had noticed that I'd underlined. He's one of the people at this, what was it called? Esalen?
Esalen, yeah.
That place where they had set up, and everybody would go there and be, to discover themselves. And,
right.
And one of the characters, I think this was the Fritz guy, he was aiming for a state of radical authenticity, unapologetic embracing of the true core self, to change paper people into real people. A person's principal goal, he believes, should be to be what you are. Being real, no matter how ugly it might make you seem, was encouraged. Mm-hmm. So that was back, in the 60s. That was sort of when they were starting to see that idea for people. And
right.
It's just, I think that what has happened with the digital world is that it's just gone over the top with that. And that because of, the part that I, of course, being working in the digital world, that I was really interested in was what happened in the chapter on the digital self, where it talks about how the computer changed things. Mm-hmm. Originally, the computer was sort of seen as a machine of conformity and control. Mm-hmm. And then when the first PC came along, and the idea of that it was your personal computer, it started to move away from that idea that it wasn't necessarily a machine for regression and coercion. It actually could all work in the service of the I.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was immediately thought of that the famous Apple commercial mm-hmm. from 1984. With the woman with the sledgehammer.
That's right.
Crashing through the Big Brother screen, right?
In a conference full of skinheads.
Yeah, all looking the same, right?
Yeah.
And she's in a bright, red shorts and white top and blonde,
short blonde hair.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I think that whole idea that changed the computer into something to serve the I, and mm-hmm. then we saw the gamification idea, where everything in human life is intensified and mm-hmm. gamified, mm-hmm. and that's good. Mm-hmm. It gets at the neoliberal aspect of it too. And I think that Will says in the book that, this resonated with something deep in the selves of the people. Mm-hmm. He called it a global encounter group in which the currency was the self. And the gold standard was personal openness and authenticity. So mm-hmm. that gets at, I think, where that kind of progressed to the point where it just being who you are, no matter, what you say or do, mm-hmm. is what you're supposed to be achieving.
Well, and it seems to be the natural evolution of neoliberal culture, right? So whether you're looking at Ayn Rand and objectivism, starting in the 1940s and 50s with her books like Atlas Shrugged, which is essentially saying that the only true moral good in the world is to serve yourself, which at the time was revolutionary, but now we almost take that for granted. And that the economies of the world, and this is Alan Greenspan, who was a student of Ayn Rand, and went on to become the chair of the Federal Reserve in the United States, and a key figure in securing the international liberal world order. Alan Greenspan essentially said that, I believe he said something along the lines of having that capitalism is not just efficient, it is moral. That serving yourself and trying to get the best out of your relationship with others is a moral imperative and not just something that is efficient and utilitarian. That there's something that is inherently good about doing that. Greed is good, from Gordon Gekko's speech in the movie Wall Street. And that all of this cultural flourishing of personal liberation is the corollary to that. And it's almost necessary to justify this neoliberal world order. But one thing I wanted to ask you before we get too far into politics is one of the pillars of this book, and he talks about it pretty early on, is the idea of consciousness, the idea of the self and where it comes from, but also the fact that the self may be an illusion. And this has actually been proved by some really fascinating experiments that have been referenced in other books, but I think Storr does a great job of elucidating them and bringing them into line of this history of the individual. What did you think about that?
I was really fascinated by that idea because I think what he was getting at was he was saying that we don't just have this one self and this is who we are, that we actually have a bunch of different selves, and that we also define that by what we think how other people see us. So it's a very fascinating. I'd never really thought about it that way, but it is true. It's like you're constantly looking at how other people see you and creating these stories. And the other part I liked about that too is just that the self is really about stories and the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And not surprisingly, we have a tendency to kind of make ourselves the heroes of our own stories.
Of course.
So this to me was the really very interesting part of it too, because this is kind of where it gets into some personal things that he was trying to explore in the course of writing this novel. And I think it was just part of it was really fascinating to me too, because at first I thought, wow, this is getting really personal, but on the other hand, I could really identify with it too. You know, I felt that he was on a personal journey to discover himself, and he was also going to write this, fantastic book about everyone else as well along the way. So, but yeah, that whole idea that we have multiple selves and we pull each one out of a hat every time depending on the situation. There's not one true self.
Well, and that he goes on this journey at the risk of discovering that the self and the feeling that you know yourself is actually kind of an illusion, that there is a feature of the brain in a human being whose entire role is to tell your story, is to give you a sense of why things are happening to you, where they come from, how your past leads up to now, and how you might be building towards the future. And it's interesting because the brain will do this even if it isn't correct, even if it doesn't have any information. So the left and right brain experiments that were done when the corpus callosum is cut, so the connection between left and right brain has been severed in some individuals medically because to stop the spread of seizures in the brain. And what is fascinating about this is that they've done experiments on some folks who have had this part of their brain removed, and therefore the left and right brain don't talk to each other. And they show an image to a person in their, what would it be? So the storytelling part of yourself and the language center of your brain is in the left side, which is your right eye. So if you perceive, say, a duck in your right eye and you don't see it in your left eye, the person who's perceiving this actually doesn't even know they've seen anything. They're not conscious of having seen anything. But what do you know? Their hand goes up and points to a duck just a minute later. And then if you ask that person, why did you point to a duck? They will tell you something along the lines of, I wanted to, or I was just thinking about a duck, or I saw a duck yesterday in a pond and it made me think of it and I just thought of it now. I have free will. It has nothing to do with anything you might have just shown me because I'm not conscious of it. So the conscious storytelling part of the brain will tell you what you want to believe regardless of what information it has. And this has huge ramifications, not just for the self, but how we perceive of the world around us.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this one quote. He says, first, the extent to which the self is a story. It turns the chaos of the outside and our inner worlds into a highly simplified narrative, which, if we're mentally healthy, serves to reassure us that we have control and all is well. So, yeah, totally.
I found it scary almost because I think there's one section in here, and I'm going to try to find the quote, where someone in the book said that free will is pretty much impossible. And here it's actually from, a professor of biology and neuroscience, Robert Sapolsky. And he says, if you devote your time to thinking about what the brain, hormones, genes, evolution, childhood, fetal environment, and so on have to do with behavior, as I do, it seems simply impossible to think that there is free will. And what concept could be more important to the Western notion of self than free will? So what did you take? Were you able to take anything from the book that reflected on your life and made you think about how you, I don't know if you want to change your life or see things differently. What did you take from this personally?
Well, I think when he talked about what he saw as the expectations on him, to achieve this perfection, and he talked a lot about that in the book, and that he was always worried that he couldn't meet those expectations, and he blamed himself.
Yeah.
And that sort of blaming yourself had to do with the fact that you're always taught that if you have a problem, it's because of your own fault, right?
Right.
So I really identified with that, and I think that I'm not alone in that, and in that if you feel like you're not up to standards in some way, then you think, well, I must not be doing a good enough job, or I'm not doing well enough, and I think that especially for me, it's around this whole area of extroversion, and like I'm totally an introvert, and I've always been, trying to be more of an extrovert, because in society we really do believe that extroverts are the answer. And so I was very fascinated by that section of it, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. Just because, also he talks about the fact that, in reality, we can't generally change ourselves that radically from what we are. Like, we were talking earlier about the personality tests and how you take the personality test. Now, I don't think anybody should be limited by any personality test, but it is kind of interesting that he talked about how he, scored high on neuroticism, and generally people don't shake that off. If you're a person who worries or stresses, it's pretty hard to kind of change that dramatically. And so I think that I felt a little better about it, and I think that's where he landed too, is that he felt a little better about things, knowing that that he doesn't always have to be trying to change who he is. Maybe he just needs to learn, we all just need to kind of learn to work within what we have, like the kind of person that we are. And also, he touches on this too, is that this idea about extroverts always being the best way to be, I think we're starting to challenge that a lot more.
Yeah.
I mean, you see introverts, banding together and forming groups, and really trying to talk about that concept that maybe being an introvert is just a different way. It's not necessarily a worse way to be.
Right.
And also he does mention that even introverts can change and present as extroverts in certain circumstances, but it's not where they're comfortable. They don't want to always be doing that, right?
Right. The way I've heard it phrased for I think I'm an introvert as well, is that it's depending on where you recharge your batteries. So if you recharge your batteries by going out to a party and hanging out with a bunch of people, well, you're probably an extrovert. But if you recharge by going into a room by yourself, reading a book, or just being in some quiet place, then you're probably an introvert. And you're right. There's a sort of a resurgence of understanding of introversion. There's a book called Quiet. I don't know if you've heard of it. I forget the author, but it's maybe something that if we do this again, we could talk about. But it's essentially saying, look, the ideal of Western society is this extroverted. In fact, there's a quote from Selfie where the ideal selfhood of today is extroverted, slim, beautiful, individualistic, optimistic, hardworking, socially aware, yet high self-esteeming global citizen with entrepreneurial guile and a selfie camera. And I think that ideal is something that we have all internalized, and whether or not we oppose it. I mean, for example, I don't like selfies. I don't like seeing them. I don't want to be in them. They make me uncomfortable. But I also know that is now becoming the ideal in our society. And it's really troubling psychologically. And a lot of other scholars have talked about this, that if you spend a lot of your time on social media, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you're essentially seeing people's airbrushed perfect lives and how you don't match up. You just don't live up to their standards because they're so great. They're reading all kinds of books, and they're so smart, and they're beautiful, and they're going to great places, and your life is frankly miserable. And the brain will only receive that information. It won't be able to make the jump subconsciously that these people presenting their perfect lives are also probably just as miserable as you are. They're just presenting all of this crap on the front. But it makes us feel bad. It brings us down. And I think that the Web 2.0, of the digital age of being represented on social media is harmful, and it's point to point with this epidemic, as you call it, of narcissism. And it's dangerous. I don't know what we do about it.
Yeah, and he did actually start the book. The first chapter is called The Dying Self.
Mm-hmm.
And it was quite interesting. All the way through this book, as I was reading it, it just became so relevant. I mean, I hate to kind of go down this path of the suicide, but, you know, like that whole, the stats that have come out about the rising rates of suicide, the two very high profile suicides. And I'm not saying that, you know, those, you know, Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade both happened really in short time frame. We don't know what those reasons were, but it really did spark that conversation again about how, you know, and he was not afraid to really talk about that dark part of things, about how people really do, if they feel like they're not measuring up, it is hard on people. And he talks about how ostracizing people is really part of the factor too, and how hard that is for people when they're ostracized.
Right.
So I think that a lot of those things were just really important things to talk about, and I think the stats came out about the rising rate of suicide right at the time I was reading this book, and I thought, wow, this is really important. We need to really talk about it. And I also wanted to mention something that is not in this book, but, you know, just happened recently, which was this YouTuber conference that was held in the U.S. And so YouTube is now the new kind of selfie sort of thing, where anybody can become famous on YouTube. And a famous YouTuber, Tana Mongeau, I think is her name, in the U.S. it was in the U.K. Anyways, she had a conference because she was shut out of VidCon, which is a big conference for YouTube producers. And so she decided to organize her own. And again, she's just a person who just became famous on YouTube. And what happened was she just organized her own conference, and the next thing you know, there's like 15,000 people lined outside waiting to get in. And so they ended up having to shut the whole thing down because there were so many people who wanted to get in, because everybody wanted to be a YouTube star, really, is what it came down to. So I think it has reached a point now where it's starting to get a little bit scary. And I think also, you know, I don't know if we're going to go here now, but, you know, talking about the president and, you know, how people see him as kind of a person who's just like them. You know, he's a reality TV star. He came from reality TV. He's somebody they identify with. And he does actually get into this in the book about Donald Trump and how he comes into this, which I really found interesting.
Well, one thing he says about Donald Trump that I remember is that Trump is the obvious conclusion of all of this self-centered philosophy of our society. That what else could you get but Donald Trump, the most egotistical, narcissistic man you could imagine, who cares for nothing but himself. And the fact that people want that, the fact that people like that, not just prefer it because they like what it says about themselves, but they think that person should be in charge. That would never have happened, maybe at any other time in human history. And maybe I'm being too glib with that, and maybe I'm completely mistaken and don't understand history. But I can't imagine someone like Donald Trump being elected, say, at any other time in the American Republic, for example. A lot of parallels are drawn with Andrew Jackson in, I think, 1828 when he was elected, but that's a different kettle of fish entirely. Andrew Jackson was a populist, but he wasn't an egoist like Donald Trump is. But what makes Donald Trump appealing to so many people is the fact that he's completely out for himself. And that whether it's because of his business enterprise or his time on The Apprentice or now being president, everything he does is motivated by that. But a lot of people would say, well, name for me a president who wasn't out for themselves. Well, I suppose, but there were norms that constrained previous presidents that don't constrain the current one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody, you're right, a lot of politicians are out for themselves, as they say, but now what's changed is that was always something that was kind of kept in the background. It wasn't like you went out and talked about it, but now he's just not even, he's unapologetic. He's out for himself, really. he does kind of try to position himself, what his needs are what everyone needs. So if it's something that's good for me, it must be good for everyone else. And he's convinced people of that. So
Right.
I really like this quote about voting. He said, "The brain, after all, isn't especially interested in facts and data. We live our lives in story mode. Our minds make sense of the world using simplistic observations of cause and effect. They confabulate, weaving a useful make-sense narrative out of what they're feeling and seeing that casts their owners in a heroic light. As well as this, they're often tribal, making automatic allies of those who look and think like them and enemies of those who don't." I mean, that's just such a perfect description.
Absolutely. And I think tribalism is at the core of what on earth is going on right now. Maybe I'm being a little bit too simplistic, and maybe tribalism has always been at the core of what's going on. But maybe what's happening now is that we feel, perhaps through the elevated pressure of social media, that everything is in crisis. And if everything is in crisis, then what else am I going to do but retreat to my in-group, my tribe, and feel like the only thing that is moral in that sense is whoever is fighting for my tribe. Whatever my tribe wants is what should be done. And if Donald Trump is the leader of my tribe, whether it's the tribe of America, the tribe of Republicans, or the tribe of the free world, whatever that is, then Donald Trump must be right in anything he does, because everything that is not him is the enemy of who I am. And it's the apotheosis of the self and the individual, going from the ancient Greeks and before to all the way until now. And maybe Donald Trump is an inevitable symptom of what's going on. However, it's also something that maybe we can correct ourselves from if we're lucky. I don't know.
I think the tech platforms are talked about in the book, and that really stood out for me too, is that you talked a little bit about this too, but they actually, in here he talks about how studies will suggest that experiences of moral outrage in normal offline life are relatively rare, with less than 5% of us experiencing it on a daily basis. But in the 2010, social media basically began, drenching people with levels of outrage that as he says, the human animal has never experienced and is not adapted to. So I think the outrage factor is escalated by social media.
Yeah, and I think that another key thing to identify with social media is that the algorithms are designed to bring you the content that will get the biggest rise out of you. And the things that are going to get the biggest rise out of you are inevitably going to be the ones that cause anger, resentment, hatred, or deep passion. And unfortunately, that's how we're wired as human beings. It's natural to be more responsive to a tiger chasing us than it is for us to feel beautiful by a lakeside. We crave those moments of high emotion. Social media provides it and makes us live in a state of almost constant emotional ecstasy, which is unfortunately often negative and hateful. And of course, the other part of it too is that social media reinforces our biases, and that our in-group, whether it's our tribe or whatever we want to call it, well, those are the only people I'm going to hear from. So of course I'm going to feel justified in my views, because as far as my brain is concerned, consciously and subconsciously, everybody in the world thinks the way that I do. I don't hear from those who don't, so they must not exist, or they must not be human. They must not have a self like I have a self.
I think it's also addictive. I mean, that's where we get into the, how the self-esteem turned into the narcissism, is that it actually, that kind of, I was just in a course this week, we were talking about this system one thinking, where people, in system one thinking are just thinking about survival and emotions, and then the more thoughtful system two thinking, that, we don't really go there that often. So if they're constantly in this system one mode where everything is a threat, then it becomes an addicting thing where you constantly want to return to that, and just checking out and going back and being more thoughtful is potentially something that takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
It requires effort. And, going back to the extrovert introvert thing, it kind of makes me wonder if people who are introverts are able to kind of disconnect from that system one thinking and then move back into a more calm, thoughtful mode.
Right.
Maybe those people are the ones we should be talking to. Like, how do you do that?
Right.
As opposed to valuing all the people who are out here, in the thick of it,
Right.
with all the moral outrage on social media. And those tend to be the people we admire and the people we flock to. And if you look at Trump right now, I mean, every day when he gets on Twitter, that's what he's doing. He's riling people up. And I watched the Netflix series on him as well, and in his life, and they talked about how he actually decides what issues he's going to focus on, including like he tested all of his things, including the building of the wall, on Twitter. So he totally decided on his policy platform based on how much outrage was created on Twitter when he tweeted about it.
Well, and a lot of people have also said that he tests it on Twitter, but he also tests it in the performance hall, in his rallies. So he'll say something completely off the cuff, and if it gets a good response, then he's going to say it again. And if he says it 10 more times, then it's policy.
Yeah.
I mean, if he's a candidate, it's going to become a platform. And if he's the president, it's the policy. Because if the president says something 10 times in 10 speeches, in 10 rallies, what else are we going to do? If you're the government of the United States, you don't say, well, that's just for a speech, because that hypocrisy can't exist in government. You have to have a government that follows the direction of what the person says you're going to do. And if the only reason that he's saying something is because it gets a rise out of people, I mean, this is self-evidently not a good way to run a society and run a government. In fact, it's extremely dangerous, but it also makes people on the other side of this conversation feel good. And that, again, is a part of what Storr is, I think, trying to say, at least in the political aspect of this book, is that what feels good is not necessarily what is right, especially if what you're feeling good is just to make yourself feel better and your story make you feel more heroic, as you were saying earlier about feeling like you're the hero of your own story. And I think that, again, Donald Trump is an impossible thing to not address in any episode of this show. But in this one, he's just so clearly the apotheosis, as I said earlier. I think there's actually a quote from Storr. He says that Trump was, in many ways, the definitive creature of the neoliberal self-esteem celebrity era. And that's another key word there, I think, which is celebrity.
Yeah. And he makes no apology also for the fact that he sort of sees everything as a game, right? And he says this a lot when he's having his rallies. He'll say, "This is a winning policy for me," and he totally is using all the language of gamification. Like, this is a game, and this is how we can win. Yeah. And I think he definitely is of that. There's winners and there's losers. I thought that part of the book that really kind of scared me was some of the discussion about this winning and losing thing. That whole idea that if you're a loser, then you're going to get left behind, and all the winners will go forward. It's just kind of like this, these are the supreme people, and anybody who's left back here, they deserve to be left back there. So it's definitely about winners and losers, and if you get left behind, we're not going back for you.
Well, and it's going back to this core idea of what do you need to do to get along and get ahead. And one thing that Storr talks about is how prior to the Industrial Revolution, again, the way to get along and get ahead was to be compliant, obedient, follow the system, and go for it. Well, I guess maybe not go for it, but just do your job. But then when the Industrial Revolution hits back in the 18th century, and then, of course, the 19th century, it really gets going, social mobility becomes prevalent in Western Europe and in North America. You can move from abject poverty to being a millionaire by the time the 20th century arrives. It's possible for you to break down barriers and live in a meritocracy, as it's been called. But what this social mobility means is that you are now completely reliant on yourself. And that's what happened, of course, in the Industrial Revolution, too. If you're smart enough, brave enough, take enough risks, and go for it, well, the world might just be yours, and you might find yourself in a position of greater power than any king or president could ever dream of. And that ethos has now been part of the fabric of our society for almost a couple hundred years. But it's a good and bad thing. I mean, who would argue against social mobility? Who would argue against the fact that someone brought up in a poor family with nothing, maybe in a country on the other side of the world where there's almost no government, could go on to succeed in their lives through their own grit and determination and smarts to be a successful person who maybe does a bit of good for the world. Should they not be rewarded? I mean, that's the ethos of neoliberalism.
Yeah, but it's the successful of the one, right?
Right, of course.
So if if we're completely focusing on just the success of one person, people can achieve incredible things. You know, any Olympic athlete or person who's climbed all the highest mountains. I mean, those people are personally successful. But I think that what I found really interesting is this discussion about whether or not that entire idea is flawed, you know, and the way that it goes back to Confucius and talks about how, you know, in there is another competing idea, and that is that, you know, really it's about the success of humanity as a whole, not just select individuals, especially since we can see that people can be individually successful and still we have large amounts of, you know, people who are not thriving.
Right.
I mean, we have this immigration right now and migration crisis that every country is grappling with. And I think that's part of that picture as well, is that if there are large swaths of people who don't have any security and safety, you know, they're picking up their children on their backs and they're walking hundreds of miles, you know, to get to another country. And this is not a small problem. It's a huge problem. So it tells you that maybe we aren't thinking about, you know, things as in a holistic way. And the people who we maybe should be valuing are maybe the people who have skills in finding solutions for problems that are going to help the largest number of people as opposed to individuals. So if you spend all your time just thinking about how you can get ahead, or if you're a different type of person, you spend all your time thinking about how large groups of people can possibly have their lives improved, then that's probably a better person that we should value.
And I think that at the beginning of the book, Storr does talk about that being selfless is inherently good and being selfish is inherently bad. And that was encoded into maybe even in our DNA from the earliest days, that giving to the tribe, to the group, is a good thing, and being out to go for yourself is a bad thing, and that creates a certain social cohesion, and that has broken down with the history of the individual. That's broken down especially in the last 200 years and 50 years, and I think that what you're saying is perfectly sensible, but there are fewer and fewer tools to make that argument. Ayn Rand, to go back to her, and the objectivist revolution of the 20th century gives a pretty good argument to the other side when she says that if you're out to serve yourself, it will benefit all of those who are hanging on to your coattails. And this goes into the Reagan era, the Thatcher era of the 1980s, where you have wealth creators. And if you just liberate these rich people, they will create prosperity for everybody. And the poorest of the poor will benefit too. But if you try to force a group view of everything, then nothing will be any good. Then the rich will not want to pursue anything, and the poor will not be able to pursue anything because they were never going to be able to do it anyways. And it's a very cynical view of human nature, of where we might be going. But I think it has not only persuaded a lot of people, it's become it's woven into the social fabric. No one has to know about Ayn Rand to believe a lot of what she argued. And therefore the tools of arguing the other side are harder and harder to find, and perhaps less and less effective, especially when, say, for example, today the hallmark of a successful society is Silicon Valley. I mean, if the American government or the Americans are going to point to anything that's working right now, it's Silicon Valley, the incredible innovation in that area. And there's a quote in this book where Storr says that people as islands of knowledge and power, but they are only as good as the value they offer. So that I am only as good as what I give back. But if I can't give anything because I'm disabled or because I'm just not apt at writing code, well then I'm valueless. And in a zero-sum game, you might as well just let me die, I guess. I mean, that seems to be the ethos of this culture. That if I'm not going to grab onto the coattails of these wealth creators, well, then I might as well just far enough behind that I've got nothing left.
I mean, I do think that to dismiss all of that neoliberalist stuff is a mistake. I mean, there's definitely some things that in there that we need to really look at and consider, but I don't think that it's the solution 100%, or even, like, this is one of the problems when we just kind of all jump onto an idea.
Yeah.
And we have this tendency to just kind of adopt it as is, and everyone just sort of hunkers down in their idea, and then they're not going to let it go. It's kind of like back to Vasco and his self-esteem. And I think it's human nature to do this, and we have to try to work really hard against it. But he was so convinced and I'm sure he did it out of best intentions. I think he really did believe that this was the way to fix the problems. But then what happened was he became so attached to the actual idea that he ignored any red flags or warning signs and just kept going down a path and going down a path. So I think that with any kind of theory about how to fix a problem, if you aren't willing to let go of parts of it, or to adapt it, or change it, or to accept good, honest criticisms of it. And there's plenty of neoliberalism, so we see that people will become wealthy and successful, and they won't help anyone else. So we know it happens a lot. So I think it's sort of like understanding our own biases and our nature, which is to get on board with something, and I think it goes back to the way we're wired. And that's what I really, wanted, the conversations I really liked in this book, is that how can we understand what it is about ourselves that make these ideas fail, and how can we, I guess, break away. I think that he talks about tribal propaganda. So I know this sounds like a simplistic, but basically what he's saying is we have to stop believing the tribal propaganda, and that we aren't as gods. My favorite quote in the book is, he says, stop believing the tribal propaganda. We're not, as we've been promised, as gods. On the contrary, we're animals, but we think we're not animals. We're products of the mud. I just love that. I like to get a t-shirt with that. This says we're products of the mud. But I mean, it's just true. Like it all comes together to me, for me at the end when he talks about this, is how we've been trained to feel like we're godlike, that we're above animals, that we're better, and that our brains are somehow on this higher plane, and we're not. And the way that we get to that higher plane is by recognizing that. It's like we're a broken thing. We need to fix ourselves. And maybe that's kind of what neoliberalism is trying to say, but I think that we have to accept some blame in there, and that we're not perfect and we're not perfectible. We're always going to have these flaws. So how do we learn to recognize our own flaws? And almost like if you were doing any kind of scientific research, and you build in things in your research to account for the fact that you have these biases, to try to take those biases out of the picture. Right. And I think we have somewhere in there is the answer. Like it's not the perfect answer, but what this tries to do, I think, is advance that discovery and just say, look, we have to recognize this about ourselves.
Yeah, and it's almost the necessary paradox of this book, is that you have a fairly stable self. We all have fairly stable personality traits that define who we are, how we interact with our world. By the time we're 6, a lot of our wiring has already been done. By the time we're having this conversation, you and I are probably not going to change that much in the rest of our lives in terms of our personality. However, at the same time, there's this sense that, does the self even exist? Is it just a byproduct of who we are as animals? I mean, it's very possible that the whole reason we have this conception of self, or even of consciousness, that things are happening, is because as animals we developed a niche through evolution where we could think through a problem, where we could sit in a tree and have something threaten us and be able to take a moment and think it through and say, instead of just do whatever the impulse is, to take a moment and think about it. And imagine our surroundings, imagine what might happen if I do A, imagine what might happen if I do B, be rational about the decision, and make the right decision based on that. But the rest of the time, when I'm not under threat by the tiger sitting at the bottom of the tree, I still have to be thinking, because I've still got this byproduct of my head, which has led to everything we have. But I guess the good part about that is at least we have the ability still to think things through, that we don't have to follow our impulses, that we can take a minute, take a breath, think things through, and put the threat on hold for a moment. I'm trying to remember where I read this, but I think it was actually an article in the New Yorker where the author describes a car crash and how time slowed down for him in the car crash. How in the 2 seconds where he had to make a decision of how to turn the steering wheel and put the car into a different gear and make sure that his baby was in the back seat and strapped in properly, he had 2 seconds. And that felt to him like eternity because his brain was able to think through the problems even under stress, even under pressure. And I think that if we forget that ability that we have from our tribal days, from us as animals, and we just follow our impulses like we do when we're taking photos of ourselves and following other people's feeds, then I think then we're really in trouble. And it doesn't really matter who's in charge. Because Donald Trump, frankly, is just the beginning. A lot of people have said Donald Trump is horrifying, but he's really just a clown. What comes next is really what should be feared.
Exactly. That's scary. I think I'm going to have nightmares.
Sorry.
But, what you said, I think feeding into that is just what we've been talking about, is that if we value that impulsiveness, though, if we elevate it, and we also have the other added factor of the good feeling we get when we act impulsively, we're going to be constantly having to fight our nature, like our first instincts all the time.
Right.
And I think that's where it becomes challenging. But the other thing, too, is that we have to stop thinking about ourselves as like, I don't know if it's the godlike part, but definitely thinking about ourselves as islands. So that if we constantly think all the time that it's on me, like this situation, whatever I'm in, I have to figure this out on my own. I can't, reach out for help. And that's the other thing, is that we tend to do that. People who ask for help, or people who are really good at, we value competitiveness over collaborativeness. Even though we talk a lot about collaboration, we really don't value it as much. But we really do have to think about that, in the sense that I think the answers to a lot of our problems are not going to be one person. So we're in this phase, I think we all know, of this cult of personality, where we tend to look for people to solve our problems for us. And we think that one person is going to solve all the problems, and then we get into our tribes and we follow, and we do whatever they say, even when they start to get really alarming and do really stupid, moronic things, but we're attached to them. But I think if we could somehow break that and realize that, no, we're kind of like all connected, and I might have one part of the puzzle and another person might have another. I still remember this team building exercise I did many, many years ago, where that was the team building exercise was to try and everybody had a piece of the puzzle on a sheet of paper, and to get everybody to try to, but there were rules around, you could only say one word from your solution that you had on your paper. And so there were all these rules in terms of how you could get the full picture, but you couldn't solve the team couldn't solve the problem. No one person could solve the problem. Everybody had to give something to that solution. Right. And it was fascinating to be part of, and also to watch, and then to hear the debrief afterwards, because it very quickly singled out like the people in the room who believed that they had all the answers. And and they very quickly dismissed, even though it was clear from the outset what this was. I mean, it was a team building exercise. So clearly the idea was to show you how important team was. Right. But even in that scenario, there were people in the room who were convinced that they could, because of that competitiveness, that they could solve this on their own, just give them enough time. And would actually, in the exercise, what happened was actually one person actually was deliberately trying to shut down people who had a piece of the puzzle and didn't want them to talk. In fact, kept telling them, no, it's not your turn to talk now, and kept, pushing them off. And that person had a piece of the puzzle. Right. So it's really interesting that we we have still those issues with competitiveness, and we still are trying to struggle with that. But I think if we could stop thinking like that and start to listen to the people in the room. And the other thing that's interesting about that whole thing is that if, as we say, and as Will talks about in the book, is that I'm on a first name basis with him now. So he just talks about how ourselves are actually defined by how we think other people see us.
Right.
So we define ourselves that way, but yet we're not very good at listening to them. It's quite fascinating actually when you think about it. But yeah, if we would start listening to the people, I mean, this is a struggle all the time in the workplace, is how do you make sure that you hear all of the different people,
right,
and their perspectives.
I think the way that Will actually puts it is that I am who I think you think I am.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
That it's 2 steps away from what I think I am. I think that I am, therefore I am. I think that I just am me. But it's not even what I think you... it's just you could go down a rabbit hole with that, which actually is quite fascinating.
But it's all about the interconnectedness.
Right. And I think you could actually treat that story of the puzzle pieces as an analog to society today. Because we all have the puzzle pieces that are necessary to make the human story go forward and to ensure progress, whatever that might be. But I think the current setup is, give me your puzzle pieces. Give them to me and I'll fix the puzzle for you.
Yeah.
And I think that is dangerous too. It's dangerous both from the perspective of the individual, but also it's dangerous in groupthink too. That if we just trust in the group that the puzzle pieces will be put together, some of the onus is on me too as an individual. But maybe the balance, what this book is arguing, is that the balance is way too far the other way. That the balance is way too much, that I am completely responsible, as if I were a god, for my own destiny and everything that has ever happened to me. And what's liberating in the end of this book is when he says, no, there are some things that you are. And you can't change your circumstance simply by willing a higher self-esteem.
No. And you don't have to necessarily change as long as you become aware of what your biases are, or, the things that are making you think and say the things that you're saying. So, so I know the book is kind of dark in places and covers a lot of ground, and you might come out feeling like really, like the future is looking pretty grim. But I actually did take a lot of positive out of it, in the fact that I really liked those kind of ideas that, I actually felt a little bit freed by the idea that you don't have to be perfect. And I also felt a little vindicated, being an introvert, that, I do have a contribution to make. It's not just all about the extroverts.
Yeah.
So I think I did take a lot away from it, and it isn't, I don't think, a negative book. It's trying to understand ourselves, which is always positive.
Yeah, I would say the same. When I picked up the book, I thought I was going to read about the doom of Western civilization. And I ended the book thinking, yeah, it's doomed, but I feel a little bit better at least about my liberation from that, and that we might have a chance of swinging the pendulum back at least a little bit the other way, because progress, as it's defined here, is frightening and maybe even inhuman. Jody, any final thoughts before we call it an end?
No, I'm just really stuck on this. We're products of the mud. I really like that. So I think that we're not as gods, and the sooner we realize that, I think we'll all be a lot happier. I think. That's perfect. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been great. That's the show. Remember that all episodes are available as a podcast, which can be accessed through any podcast app or found on the website www.wogoshow.com. Your quote of the week is from a different book by Will Storr called The Unpersuadables, Adventures with the Enemies of Science. It's a quick one. Quote, "We typically have a bias that tells us we are less susceptible to bias than everyone else." Close quote. When it comes to ourselves, what biases might we have, and what biases might we be avoiding? Thanks for listening.